Hello and welcome to Pit Talk, a Fox Sports and Speed Cafe Formula One podcast. On today's episode, Max Verstappen dominates the Austrian Grand Prix to extend his already comfortable championship lead, but a marathon steward's investigation over track limits, how exciting, dominates post-race discussion. My name's Michael Laminato, motorsport writer for Fox Sports Australia. It's great to have your company and the company of these two men. First up, from Speed Cafe, he's still counting all 1,200 track limits breaches. It's Matt Kosh.
I've got a spreadsheet for all that. It's fine. We're all good.
And also from Speed Cafe, I'm reliably informed, poring over the laws of cricket, it's Ian Parks.
Yeah, let's not talk about the Ashes. Moving swiftly on, thank you.
2-0.
We've got plenty to talk about as well, which is good news following the Australian Grand Prix. Now, before we get into, obviously, all the post-race shenanigans, let's start and relatively quickly as he finished the race, get out of the way Max Verstappen's win, extending the championship lead. Pretty comfortable, all things considered. I want to go straight to that fastest lap attempt at the end, Matt. A little bit of debate over whether it was worthwhile, but what does that say, the fact that Red Bull and Max took that risk to go for that point about the whole championship picture?
Yeah, that's big kahuna stuff, that is, really, isn't it? Because he's got a 24-second lead win, or 23.9 as he enters the lane. It's a 20-second loss. If there's any sort of mistake, any fumbling, he loses the win for 1 point. But it goes to show how confident that Max is in the team, that he's willing to place that sort of faith in the mechanics. They turned him around, he got out on track, and then he went gangbusters on that final lap, got the bonus point, walked away with 26 on top of the points that he got for the sprint race as well, or the F1 sprint. It's definitely not a race. But so, it's just, yeah, absolutely. But it's just it's an extraordinarily brave and bold thing to do. I mean, admittedly, the risk rather is minuscule because he's got such an advantage. Even if he loses 25 points in the championship, all it really does is interrupt his run of wins. So it was calculated, and I think, why not? It's a bit of bravado, and it really sends a psychological message to everyone else in pit lane.
It was literally taking the proverb. I can use the word Michael, can't I? It was taking the Michael. There we go. It was.
I'm satisfied.
Speaking to Christian Horner afterwards, he mentioned that there was a lot of talk within the team as to do we go for it. Max was coming over the radio apparently to them saying, "Oh, my tyres are shot. I need to come in, guys. I need to come in." Yeah, so you mean your worn tyres are not going to make it round for one more lap with a 23-second advantage? So he told us about as well that they lived by the mantra of Dietrich Mateschitz, the former owner, late owner, of course, who passed away last year, and whose memory they were racing in particular this weekend, being in Austria. And Dietrich's mantra at that time was effectively go big or go home. We're here to race, but we're also, let's take some risks. Let's go for it. So it was Christian's final call. I asked him personally, did you have final sign-off on that? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, did you have any qualms about it? He said, once I'd spoken to all the guys and they were in agreement, we just went for it. And that's exactly what they did. And yeah, they took the Michael out of it, basically. It just shows how much they've got in hand, doesn't it?
Well, can I just dwell on that point for a second? Because I've written this down because it's too complicated for me to remember. Red Bull's advantage at the moment in the championship is such that rival teams would have to outscore it on average at every race between now and Abu Dhabi by 16.5 points just to be in with a shot of the Constructors' Championship. That's how far Red Bull is ahead. Its worst race of the year was Monaco, where it only scored 25 points for Max Verstappen winning. I mean, it's in a league absolutely of its own.
Why would you bring the tone down like that in the first episode? What are you doing? Come on, man.
I love a spreadsheet. You're not going to divorce me from that.
And look, we'll have plenty more over the course of the season, I'm sure. I don't want to hear about the Max Verstappen amount of championship points over the course of the rest of the season yet. Please keep that stat in your pocket till after the mid-season break at least. Not before. We've got plenty of other stuff to talk about. I want to talk about Sergio Perez a little bit later on because I guess this was on balance a fairly positive weekend for him by recent standards. But let's really go straight to what was honestly the bulk of Sunday, considering how many hours it took for us to get to the conclusion of the track limits fiasco, if you like, or saga, prompted by an Aston Martin post-race protest, although the FIA says it was already aware that there were just way too many issues with the track limit situation. Ian, you were on the ground in Austria. I've always enjoyed, in a weird, perverse way, these long post-race discussions when I've been in the media centre because there's a real febrile atmosphere, I think, once you tick over hour one. What was it like picking through this one?
That wasn't actually too bad. I've done worse than that in the past. I can trust you. Promise you on that one. So, as I say, it wasn't too bad, but it was a case of, oh, for goodness sake, how many more? And then you see messages come through and the FIA talking about in excess of over 100 laps deleted. And then you see the verdict come through and it's like they were investigating 1,200, was it, Matt? In excess of 1,200, something like that, potential breaches that have been reported. The problem is, we have known about this for a long time. This wasn't nothing new with the Red Bull Ring. And I think I'm going to flip it straight away to the positive, rather than discussing about the fact that, should white lines, etc., should curbs, should we have gravel. The FIA straight away said that they have made a recommendation to the circuit, we want gravel traps from next season, please. And I thought that was actually really positive. Now, speaking to the FIA post-race, I was told that Michael Massey, when he was race director, recommended that be a course of action to be taken. And actually last year as well, Niels Wittig, in his report to the circuit post-race, because the FIA gives feedback to the circuits as to what they can do better, what worked well, etc. Niels Wittig also stated in his report, please, may we have gravel traps? The problem is, it's down to the circuit. The FIA cannot force the hand of the circuit. They can make recommendations and tell them to do this and that, but it's down to the circuit. I think there was such a furore on this occasion that I think the circuit on this occasion is going to finally listen to the FIA feedback. Of course, what the circuit has to consider is all the other sporting events that take place over the course of a year, and in particular why those curbs are in place at turns 9 and 10 is for MotoGP. But as I say, the FIA at least giving it to the circuit and saying, look, come on guys, we've got to do this now.
Matt, is it too narrow a perspective? I mean, you sort of mentioned it, Ian mentioned it there, MotoGP, that's coming up relatively soon in terms of the two-wheel calendar. Obviously, nothing's going to be done before then because gravel is not for two wheels. But sometimes, is this not a case of F1 having to step back and think about the preferred option being gravel, not really being appropriate for tracks it races on, which don't exist just for Formula One, unlike most of the street tracks we race on?
This is a world championship. This is the pinnacle of four-wheel motorsport. There is no excuse for it to be dragged through the mud like it was yesterday because of the circuit wanting to cut corners, basically. That's effectively what it comes down to. It's it wanting to serve both MotoGP and Formula One with the same solution, which is not appropriate for one over the other. In this instance, the safety of MotoGP riders should not and cannot be compromised. Let's not throw them to the wolves here. The circuit needs to protect them, but at the same time, that can't compromise the product of Formula One, which is the flagship event of that venue. So something needs to be done, whether that's dropping curbs behind the red and white curbing there for MotoGP, whether that's a reprofiling. Just look at what they've done at Spa-Francorchamps with the return of motorcycle racing there. They put a cut through at the corner that doesn't have a name that is sometimes referred to as Speaker's Corner. They put a cut through there so that it doesn't matter that the runoff there isn't suitable for MotoGP because it doesn't use the car racing circuit. So there's things that can be done. I don't know why they haven't done that. It's inexcusable given that they've spent so much money on that venue and this is Red Bull's flagship product. They want to be showing the brand and everything else off to the best of their ability. And they just look silly yesterday. Formula One, in my opinion, doesn't look silly. The track looks silly because racing drivers are going to abuse whatever limits you give them. They're going to push it right up to the edge. And if they're able to step over that edge, then of course they're going to. There needs to be a natural barrier in there, and that's gravel traps or something else. But there needs to be that balance with MotoGP and everything else to make sure that it's workable. They need to find that solution, and they need to make that a priority before we get back there next year.
Just to add there, guys, that once that all came to light, what the decision from the stewards, I asked the circuit if I could speak to their general manager, a gentleman by the name of Eric Wolf. I was told that he doesn't do interviews. So they did give me a very short statement in response that basically said that the FIA, that they will work together with the FIA to try and find a suitable solution. So it's something. Whether we will see anything different in place in 12 months' time, who knows?
Yeah, keyword there, try.
Yeah. All right, let me ask the obvious question before we move on from track limits. Isn't this a driver's problem? I mean, it's drivers who are disobeying track limits. The track limits are pretty obvious. When I drive in my road car, I know I've got to stay within the lanes. I know not everyone in Melbourne is good at that, and so maybe not all F1 drivers are also good at that. But isn't it just a matter of drivers seeing that they're receiving penalties and acknowledging that that's not the way to go about it?
That's not the case. Matt, do you want to take it up?
Yeah, look, there's an element of that, absolutely, in that drivers shouldn't abuse track limits. But if it's there, aren't we going to? I mean, the yellow light is there, and we all run those occasionally, don't we? We should stop, but we don't. It's just human nature that if something is there and we can gain an advantage, we're going to do it. So there needs to be a natural barrier there to prohibit that sort of abuse of track limits. You know, we've seen it everywhere. Monza's a good one coming out of Variante Ascari. At Bahrain at turn 4 at the top of the hill there. You know, they've managed to mitigate the track limits issue by and large, but unless there's a natural barrier there, of course they're going to maximise it because there's lap time there. And if they can risk a little bit more and get away with it, then that's a massive advantage. If you add that up, if you can save 1/10 of a second over 70 laps, then that can be the difference between points or no points, or Charles Leclerc being close enough to Max Verstappen to prevent him from pitting on the final lap.
But what I will add to that as well, sorry, Michael, what I will add to that as well is that speaking to a lot of the drivers, it's not as simple as trying to stay in the white lines. You've got to remember that a lot of those infringements yesterday, we are talking potentially millimetres or just a centimetre or two. That's the equivalent, if you want to take Matt's analogy, of hitting that yellow light a split second too soon. Yeah, you've effectively hit that yellow light just as it's changing to yellow. Well, these guys are doing pretty much the same in their Formula One cars. They are crossing that white line literally by the smallest of margins, and they're getting penalised for it. So it's taken to the absolute letter of the law at Spielberg, at the Red Bull Ring. And you've got to think that these cars are much heavier, they're much wider. The momentum that they're carrying down the hill out of turn 10, out to turn 8, into turns 9 and 10 is vast as well. And so that's why I think we've had so many penalties over the course of this past weekend. So there has to be a degree of leniency on behalf of the FIA. But of course, the FIA, as we all know, acts to the strict letter of the law, and the car has to be kept between the white lines. And even if you're 2 millimetres, a millimetre over, that's a rule breach as far as they're concerned.
For what it's worth, I think they should just bring back those curbs that absolutely destroyed the cars every time they drove on them. I think that's the solution. We'll wait and see what happens next year, but it'll be fascinating to see what the track decides is the best option. Let's move on, though, to what I think was one of the other major talking points of this weekend, because while Ferrari seemed to take a bit of a step forward, we were still really only talking about being at the top of that front-running B category, if you like, or the upper midfielders, if you want to be slightly uncharitable. For me, the really interesting result was Lando Norris, who was really competitive all weekend. We know he really loves racing at the Red Bull rings, never qualified lower than 6th or finished lower than 7th bar once, I think, the Styrian Grand Prix during one of the COVID years. This was another very strong performance from him, but more to the point, a strong performance for this upgraded McLaren we've been talking about now for quite a few months, the first of a 3-stage upgrade. So good, they're going to do it 3 times over the next 2 races. He was the only McLaren driver that had the upgrade package, did really well at the end. Matt, let's start with you. Are we reading too much into the quality of this upgrade given Lando's historical performances here, or is this really actually quite a bright sign for the team?
It's a little bit of both, I think. If we're being charitable, it's a really positive sign. If we're being realistic, we need to wait probably until we get to Silverstone. Realistically, beyond that, even beyond Hungary, when the package is complete, we need to look at probably after the summer break to really take stock of what they've got. But this package is being rolled out over 3 events for Lando, so you got the first part of that last weekend. He'll get the next part in Silverstone, and then the last part in Hungary. They rushed it through. They didn't have a lot of time to test and optimize it, given that it was a sprint weekend. They only had the 60 minutes of practice on Friday, so they won't know much about that package at this point. Therefore, the balance of Lando's performance is probably skewed in Lando's favour, in my opinion, because the team still won't really know exactly what it's got, particularly when you consider that this is only roughly half of the upgrade that will go on to Lando's car. You've got half of it in Austria, and the other 50% of the MCL 60B, as I term it, is coming over the British and Hungarian Grand Prix. So let's take it with a grain of salt. Yes, it's very positive, but we know Lando is something of a Red Bull Ring whisperer, like he is at Monaco. He's just got a groove around that place. So let's put a little asterisk next to him and say, yeah, that's positive. That's a really strong weekend. It's a good sign for McLaren. But let's not start talking about them in the same frame as perhaps Alpine and Aston Martin and Mercedes and Ferrari just yet. I think they're still a little way off the back of that group, but it's a really good start. We just need to see that progress down. We need to see that from Oscar as well when we get to Silverstone to really validate what we saw in Austria.
Yeah, I agree. Speaking to all 3 guys over the course of the weekend, Andreas Della, team principal, Lando and Oscar, there was a sense that they have made a step forward compared to what they had previously. As Matt pointed out, though, the anomaly of a sprint weekend is that there's not that much running to which you can compare. So they had 1 practice session before they absolutely had to nail it in qualifying on Friday evening. But there are signs enough there that, yes, now we can accelerate with the other 2 areas of the upgrade package due to come for the British and Hungarian Grand Prix. But, caveat, let's see what really happens at Silverstone when we've got more opportunity to assess, and also with the first part, at least, of the upgrade package that we saw in Austria going onto Oscar's car for the British. We're not quite sure yet whether Oscar will have the full package that will be on Lando's car at Silverstone, simply because it's a race against time with regards to spares. So he might still be running that step behind, as we saw at the Red Bull Ring.
Can we read anything into the disparity between Lando and Oscar this weekend? I mean, part of the qualifying picture was, again, track limits, our favourite subject of the week. For how many more weeks, we'll wait and see. But part of it was his race was not really on the same level, got caught in a bit of a morass in the midfield, picked up some damage. Was this just more of a circumstantial off result, or was there really something in the fact that they were performing at quite different levels, it seemed, for a lot of the Grand Prix?
No, I don't think so. I think there was just one of those anomalous weekends, I think, for Oscar. As you mentioned, he got done for track limits in Q2 on Friday evening with a time that would have been good enough, regardless of all the other laps that were deleted as well, that with a time that would have been good enough to have got him into Q3. So that was just circumstance. And then going into Saturday, it was not. We could see then, I think, the difference between the 2 McLarens. I think we had a better idea as to what was doing well on Lando's car compared to what was doing well on Oscar's car. And as you mentioned with regards to the race on Sunday, one of his issues was that he ran into a gaggle of cars at one particular corner and he broke his front wing. And that necessitated an extra pit stop. And that's why he was pitched so far down the pack. Otherwise, he might just have been pushing for a point, perhaps. Hard to Hard to say, given all the penalties, etc., that took place, but he might just have been there or thereabouts. So I think for Oscar, it was just one of those weekends. And I think with the upgrade package that he knows is going to be on his car at Silverstone this weekend, he's going to be hopefully back to the Oscar that we've seen performing so well and has made him so highly rated within that team. Zach Brown even going as far as to say there's a future world champion. So we know he's got it. As I say, let's not read too much into that one, Michael.
And he's a rookie. He's 9 races into his Formula One career. There's going to be inconsistency. He got caught out. He got unlucky with those cars checking up ahead of him at turn 3. So the performance isn't a true representation of his pace and his racecraft and all those sorts of things, or the car potential for that matter. We don't know exactly where the MCL 60 versus the MCL 60B stands. Is it the B or the B.1 at this point? We get to the B.3 at Hungary. It's
depends if Ron Dennis is involved in naming convention still, I think, isn't it?
Let's go into full Ron speak, shall we? So the outcome wasn't a true reflection of Oscar. He will have ups and downs, of course he will. But on the whole, it's not the car in that instance. It was just circumstances, as Ian mentioned.
Just before we move on from McLaren as well, it is a big upgrade package. It's really hard to get a handle on where the midfield's been this year. I think because we've had so many, particularly in the last 2 months, fairly big upgrades from some of the key players that it's been a bit difficult to get a good form guide going. But does McLaren have expectations of where it hopes to be, let's say, on the other side of the mid-season break? I mean, obviously we know where it aspires to be, but realistically where it thinks it can end up once it has the car on the track that it expects to be, the development trajectory that it wants?
4th. There you go.
I mean, it's a nice round number. Well, it's not really a round number, is it? It's just a nice number.
Yeah, it's what it. Bearing in mind where it started from, I'm not necessarily saying 4th in the Constructors' Championship because the gap is already quite significant, even to the second place team. I think they're looking at being, over the second half of the season, the 4th best team with the 4th quickest car, certainly pushing 2 and 3 if we just completely rule Red Bull out the equation because they're so far ahead of everybody else. But I think they know that from where they were at the start of this season, which was a really bad place, which was, as they said, in pre-season, far behind on the development curve, and playing so much catch-up over the first half of this season with what they could do to the car before bringing this upgrade package. I think they know that they're in that position, in that ballpark, then they're going to have a good platform on which to build going into next season.
Yeah, McLaren.
Go on.
So, McLaren scored 12 points in Austria. That's equal with their best result of the year, which was Australia, where they had both Oscar and Lando in the points. So it's a strong result. They're clearly their best single result of the year, but they've got a mountain to climb still. Ian says, being the 4th best team, not necessarily in the Constructors' Championship, but being 4th best on the road, that's a big ask to do that consistently, as we've seen this year, because Ferrari's inconsistent. Aston Martin, which is clearly the second best team at the moment, is inconsistent. Mercedes is up and down week to week as well. So it's going to be interesting if they can iron out some of those peaks and troughs. That's got to be the aim for everyone at this point, because Red Bull doesn't seem to have them. So it's achievable. They've got to iron that out. And if you can do that, your bad weekends aren't going to be so bad. Your good ones might not be necessarily quite as big if you flatten out that curve, but you're going to be more consistent. And over the course of the last 10 races of the year, that's got to stand you in good stead.
It's funny if you look at these last... Sorry, Mark, I was just going to very quickly add to Matt's point. It's funny how you look at when the teams have brought an upgrade, the momentum that they've gained from that over a particular race weekend. So if you think about Mercedes when they brought their upgrade, we saw it in Monaco first off, but that was a circuit that was never going to be right for their package. So we had to wait for Spain before we saw what it could do. It went really well there. Aston Martin brought a package to Canada. It went really well there. Ferrari brought its package to Austria, as did McLaren. And we know that both cars went well there. Mercedes has got the second part of its upgrade coming for this weekend at Silverstone. It is now expecting to make that step forward. So I think we might see Mercedes being the second quickest team behind Red Bull at Silverstone this weekend. And then, of course, we've got to see what the second part of McLaren's upgrade does to its car with Lando Norris.
Well, you've segued perfectly, Ian, because I want to touch on briefly before we wrap this one up Ferrari's performance over the course of this weekend. For the vast majority of the start of this season, Ferrari has been underwhelming, not least because last year, at least at this point last year, the team was supposed to be Constructors' Championship champions. It was well in the lead of the Constructors' Championship, in fact, after leaving last year's Australian Grand Prix. We all know how that ended up. They've had a variety of problems with the car this year. Some upgrades earlier in this year didn't seem to do too much to sort them out either. Austria, though, maybe this is the best way to describe Ferrari performance, very competent performance. Just solid, no massive mistakes, just seemed very straightforward. The car seemed performing well as well and was pretty comfortably at the head of that Mercedes, Aston Martin, Ferrari battle. Now, we've talked about how this track has its own characteristics. Some cars have typically done well here. This was where Ferrari last won its race. But if you're a Ferrari fan, Matt, are you allowing yourself to feel like maybe the team's turned a bit of a corner this season? We're not talking about, as Charles Leclerc obviously said, Red Bull challenges, still half a minute up the road. Yeah. But at least this was not a depressing outcome for this team.
It was a positive weekend. As you say, it was the first of the rest, if you like. But it also built on a similarly positive weekend in Canada where it made a strong strategy call. It had good performance in the car. That it didn't seem to suffer from the vagaries that have plagued it earlier in the season, namely, eating its tyres alive. It seemed to hang on doing that. Yes, the degradation is still higher than what Red Bull and others suffer. But what we saw in Austria validates what we saw in Canada. There's been a step forward at Ferrari, and I don't necessarily think that's exclusively related to the upgrades that they've bought. Because they've dripped a few upgrades out over recent races. They had some in Spain and then they had some again in Austria. But there's a confidence now on the pit wall, and within that team it seems to have settled a little bit after a little bit of a flurry in the start of the year. And that for me started in Canada. Once they got through that momentum was carried into Austria. Carlos Sainz, I'm not going to say he got unlucky to lose fourth because obviously he abused track limits, but to have Charles in second, and probably lucky that Carlos Sainz was battling with Sergio Perez in the latter stages to delay him, but have second and fourth, that's a really positive weekend. That's the best result that Charles Leclerc has had this season rather. It's only his second podium of 2023. So there is a momentum growing there. There is optimism, and deservedly so, I think, in Maranello. So it'll be interesting to see how they cope when we get to Silverstone this weekend. The Ferrari doesn't like high-speed corners. There's more than a couple of those in Silverstone. So I think the momentum will slow the British Grand Prix, but there is still cause to be enthusiastic for the back half of the year.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident that they're not going to be the first of the best, as Matt put it, at Silverstone. I think we're going to see this leapfrogging, that when a particular team brings something of significance to a particular race, that team will be the best of the rest behind Red Bull. Unfortunately, we just keep saying Red Bull's out there, that no one seems to be able to challenge them. That's what we're really missing, isn't it? That Red Bull, despite its budget cap penalty with the restrictions on wind tunnel testing and CFD, it's barely added anything to its car, and it still has this huge gap between them and the rest. Hopefully someone somewhere is going to make a leap soon enough that will allow us to enjoy a full-on race weekend of action. As we saw yet again, in fairness, take Max Verstappen out of the equation. This is what we said after the last Grand Prix in Canada. Take Max Verstappen out of the equation, and actually we've got a pretty damn good racing field going on from second down to wherever. It's just unfortunately Max is just head and shoulders above everybody else. Sorry to finish it on a downward note, folks. I didn't mean to do that.
Well, as the representative of the broadcaster, you have my explicit permission to put a bit of masking tape over where the first position is on your television. Consult your television manufacturer, but if that makes the races more exciting, then go right ahead. Might make it a little bit more enthusiastic. Just before we wrap this one up, Ian, we've got Silverstone this weekend. You've already touched on some expectations for that best of the rest, best of everyone else position. I want to talk Mercedes specifically, and Aston Martin to a lesser extent. Both had sort of down races in Austria compared to, well, let's say recent results. But Mercedes in particular, two British drivers coming to the home of British motorsport, the British Grand Prix. Could continue to say British, but it'd start to get a little bit weird. How much pressure's on Mercedes to bounce back here? You mentioned they've got a big upgrade coming, but considering, Hamilton has a lot of support here, Russell's got a lot of support, it's a big weekend for them.
Yeah, I'm just going to temper that slightly. You're talking about a big upgrade. It's not that big, to be fair. I do know exactly what's going on in the car, but unfortunately I've been sworn to secrecy. I've not been allowed to say as yet. But it is significant. It should give them another step forward, and I'm expecting that team with both its drivers at their home race to be firmly back on the pace at a circuit that pretty much we know that the Red Bull Ring is enjoyable for Ferrari. They've generally gone quite well there. Mercedes has always enjoyed the Silverstone. That car at the moment, even with the fact that it's been updated most recently, enjoys medium to high speed corners. And that's what Silverstone is all about. So I'm hoping that they are going to be giving Red Bull a better run for their money than we've seen any other team push Red Bull so far this season, given what I know is going on the W14 for this weekend. Beyond that, if it doesn't happen, then it won't be quite back to the drawing board for Mercedes, but I think they're going to be starting to scratch their heads and thinking, well, we thought we'd got something out of this package. What's happened? Because that was certainly the feeling coming out of Austria, that for whatever reason, that car didn't quite work as well as they were anticipating going into the weekend.
It really is an important weekend for Mercedes if you stop and think about it in that context, because if the upgrades work, then they're on a clear path forwards. If the upgrades don't work, then this is the point that they need to stop, reevaluate, and start looking at 2024, you think, because they're not going to make significant progress or significant worthwhile progress for the back half of this year. You cut your losses and you've got to start looking at 2024. Let's hope they work, because I think we need that extra fight behind Red Bull to keep us all awake in the wee hours. But Silverstone is a circuit that's going to play to Red Bull's strengths. They're going to be strong. McLaren, we know that's a car that works well on high-speed corners and has good straight-line speed. So I'm predicting a positive weekend for McLaren. Ferrari, they'll fall away. Aston Martin is the unknown for me. Spain is, I guess, the most representative event that we've had thus far in terms of circuit layout, and it wasn't its strongest. So we'll see what happens there. But, it's a big weekender, I think, for Mercedes.
It's always a big weekend at the British Grand Prix. You can catch coverage live on Fox Sports. You can read about it not only on the Fox Sports website, but the Speed Cafe website as well. Matt, Ian, thanks so much for your company for the first episode of Pit Talk even. We can walk in the pit lane and we can talk about it as well. And that's all the time we have for Pit Talk in the first episode. Thanks so much for joining us. You can subscribe to Pit Talk wherever you get your favourite podcasts. And we'd love it if you could leave us a rating and a review as well. Pit Talk is a production between Fox Sports and Speed Cafe. We'll catch you next time.